Friday, 22nd of June 2012, and welcome to another generalist introduction to history podcast. This is Tony Curzon Price, and I'm again in conversation with Terence Mitchison. And last time, if you should go and listen to last week's podcast if you haven't. If you have, you'll know that we talked about modern Greek history, and we more or less covered the period from 1832 independence to more or less 1920. The great population movements arising out of the war with the new nation Turkey. And Terence, so what we want to do is try and get through a very complicated 20th century today. The period from 1920 to 1943, I suppose, is one part of what we want to do. Complicated and turbulent period. We want to talk about the Civil War, which is more or less 43 to 49, 52. We want to talk about the period from there to 68, and then the Colonel's coup, 68.
Coup and
until 74.
The period following the dictatorship, as it were, and the evolution of the balance between the two major parties today.
Exactly, and in a sense, at least what I would hope to do is to get to a point at which I have some sense of what it is that has led to the present configuration of Greek politics and the Greek, let's say, political culture, Greek relationship to their state.
Fine. Let's take off then where we left off last time and look at the picture, I suppose, in the mid-1920s, or perhaps the early 1920s, because the political consequence of the loss of the Anatolia campaign to the Turks under Kemal Ataturk was, of course, fairly traumatic for Greece. The immediate consequence being to place a great deal of blame both on the king, Constantine I, who had been the commander-in-chief and effectively the figurehead, and was substantially blamed for disastrous loss of the war, and to a lesser extent blame on the main political figure, Eleftherios Venizelos. And so that we had a coup of disgruntled officers, seized power in 1922, a fairly unstable situation after that, when there was
the monarchy is maintained or is re-established. Constantine's in exile.
As it were, flies into exile while Constantine dies. His older son Alexander had died previously from monkey bite. His second son George II, who is ultimately a quite able and astute figure, is young, but really in great difficulty at this stage, because I think a substantial number of the officers, and a substantial part of public opinion, veers round to shall we say, an essentially Republican position. And there's constant interference by officers in what is happening. So what we ultimately have is the proclamation of a republic in 1924. An admiral, Koundouriotis, becomes much respected Republican president, but unfortunately it doesn't bring stability. We have, I think, a degree of sort of idealism behind the idea of a republic. Somehow, if you replace this rather seemingly pro-German conspiratorial monarchy with a republic, with a Greek president,
and a constitution which hasn't been in place before, is that right?
Yes, we haven't actually had a proper republic. We've had a series of interregnums in the 19th century, but if you recall, we have the very long reign of George I, a relatively successful monarch. But essentially, he's a Dane. His son Constantine is related to Kaiser William. The royal family, through its relationships, is seen as being essentially sort of too much, perhaps related to both Germany and to Britain, subject to foreign influences. And the idea, I think, that we move away from this sort of highly rather personal, perhaps I think democratic interference in the political life of the country, have something in the nature of a republican constitution.
And this is Venizelos. This is his program.
In the scenes, it has to be said that at this point, Venizelos is somewhat under a cloud because of his shall we say, failure to rescue Greece from the Anatolian disaster. So he's actually out of the political scene, either abroad or in Crete, for much of this period. And he doesn't actually rematerialise until 1928. And so you have this period in the 1920s where there's an unstable republic, and you have a series of military interventions, some of which are hinged around problems with foreign relations. So there's a short, shall we say, sort of unpleasant incident with the Bulgarians to the north. It leads to a coup by a general called Carlos, who sets up a rather farcical military dictatorship and attempts to sort of peg prices and also dictate the length of women's skirts. He's replaced by another general called Kondilis, who attempts to sort of regulate the country, but eventually hands over to the civilians. There's a chaotic period for 2 years between 26 and 28, and eventually, when Venizelos returns, he's effectively forgiven for any past mistakes and seen as the political saviour, one man who has sufficient understanding of the international diplomatic scene, perhaps to win some support for Greece and some successes, together with the subtlety to navigate the shoals of domestic politics.
And just say a little bit about the army. I mean, with all these coups, is the army a sort of a serious institution that has that has some kind of sense of its role in the nation's history and life, and as a spine for the nation? Is it a powerful institution?
Yes, it's a very powerful institution. I think it probably, like in many Balkan countries, provides quite an outlet for talent for people who may not have opportunities in commerce or other fields.
So it's meritocratic, is it? At least in part.
It becomes, shall we say, a sort of a magnet for the young, disgruntled, but talented. There's also, shall we say, a sort of regrettable lack of, shall we say, proper professional discipline. They don't sort of simply stick to preparing for wars, but they speculate manically about politics. The army is enormously political, constant discussion.
Are they closely involved in the economy, as happens subsequently in a lot of militarised regimes?
Yes, there's a lot of military contracting. The army is probably quite a big part of the budget, and of course the navy as well at this stage. So they're quite a major presence in terms of the national economy, and contracting military supplies are important. So there's influence throughout the economy. But I think what you probably find in many other European countries, you have a big military establishment, but it's under fairly firm political direction. What you don't have in Greece, I think, is this firm sense of political control over the military and naval establishment.
Right.
The generals or the colonels.
And just sort of checking off the institutions, as it were. What about the role of the church and the Orthodox Church?
Well, the church is powerful, and in some places it has been sort of quite political. But at this particular stage, I think what you find is that the church sees itself as ministering essentially to the spiritual side and to traditional values. It's a highly traditional body. Because the higher ranks of the clergy are somewhat dominated by monks, people who are deliberately otherworldly. So at this stage, it's perhaps less integrated into what you might loosely describe as the political and cultural life.
So it respects the separation of the realm of Caesar and the realm of God.
I think that's absolutely correct. I don't think the church sees itself in this particular stage of Greece's life as being a body that needs to intervene politically. We'll talk about Cyprus later, because it's a quite different situation.
And tell us again briefly, since this is going to become important. How about the Communist Party?
Well, I think the Communist Party first evolves really with the creation of a larger working class. The area around Athens, there's indeed a suburb called New Smyrna, where a lot of the refugees from Anatolia arrive, and there's a large disgruntled, unemployed or underemployed proletariat. Very low wages, a fairly stop-start economy during the 20s, and essentially Greece is a fairly overpopulated, underemployed economy. There's also the problem that the United States, which had been a ready taker of Greek emigrants in the period before the First World War adopts far more restrictive policies on immigration in the early 1920s, reduces the quota drastically. And the British Empire attempts at the same time to reduce immigration from places other than Britain.
Right.
So,
remittances presumably are a big part of the Greek economy. Remittances from that.
Yes, are very important. The period
from that diaspora
of the First World War made a major difference. I think they're still quite considerable in terms of contributing to the Greek balance of payments.
Yes.
But the problem, I suspect, is that though there are still remittances, there is still income coming in from Greeks abroad to support their parents in mountain villages. What you don't have is this outlet for a surplus population in emigration overseas, where that is blocked off to a considerable extent, particularly in this period between the First World War and the Second World War.
And of course, not only is emigration blocked off, but we must remember, this is where we left the last podcast, there's been this huge immigration of Greeks from Anatolia. That's 1.4 million Greeks, about a fifth of the population have come in.
Yes. I think that's absolutely correct. In theory, there has been quite a large, shall we say, swap of population. So there was quite a large Muslim population that left many parts of northern Greece and Crete and some of the islands. In practice, although the figures are not very accurate, one suspects this was far less, perhaps only sort of half the number of Greeks who actually arrived. So the swap of populations has increased the population of Greece quite considerably. It's also meant, I think, that the population is slightly more unbalanced. There are many urban refugees. There are quite a few people who then move into areas that have become underpopulated as a result of the emigration of Muslims towards Turkey. And there was quite a large redistribution of land in northern Greece, in Macedonia and Thrace. So there was also at the same time in the 1920s a redistribution of large former Turkish chiefliks or fiefdoms, and a lot of that land comes into the possession of small peasants. But a lot of these peasants are operating a fairly marginal economy, particularly in mountain areas. They have seasonal lack of employment. In the winter periods when they used to go down into the towns and find employment, they now find that there are already people there who are desperately searching for work. So overall, you get an agricultural economy predominantly searching for outlets, and far too many people searching for available jobs either in the countryside or the towns.
Terence, is Greece hit very badly by the global depression of the 1930s then?
Yes, indeed it is. And I think one particular problem was the fact that Venizelos tried very hard to help the difficulties of the Greek economy by seeking foreign loans, mainly from the US and Britain, in the period immediately before the Great Depression. So at the end of the 1920s, these foreign loans are made essentially to improve the infrastructure, improve highways, improve land drainage, to improve agricultural production. And the interest on the loans is already heavy. The repayments of the capital fall due in 1932, the worst period of the Depression, faced with the most terrible difficulty in repaying the capital on its debts. And a desperate attempt is made by Venizelos to go around the capitals of Europe seeking some form of emergency financial aid. He doesn't get it because almost all the rest of the world is in the same financial trauma straits. And therefore, in 1932, Greece has to default on its overseas loans. That shuts it out of international financial markets. There is temporary financial chaos. And there is also temporary political chaos because Venizelos has to resign. There is then a box and cock situation between Venizelos and his liberal republicans on the one hand, with the gradually more pro-monarchist populist party on the other hand. The two sort of oscillate in and out of office for a period of about 2 years. Venizelos eventually retires altogether. The populists get the upper hand, win elections in 1934, and the populist leader, Tsaldaris, effectively sort of paves the way for the reintroduction of the monarchy.
And so the populist party one would consider to be a party of the right, a traditionalist party of the right. Would that be a fair characterization?
I'm not sure that it would. I think at this stage you'd probably say there were elements that were right-wing. It's possibly slightly more based on the larger landowners. But I think there's quite a lot of regional variation. I think that the Venezuelists are probably strongest in Crete and some of the islands, populists more in other parts of Greece. And the programmes are not, I think, what you would describe as a traditional left-right. I suspect that the populists also appeal in some ways to certain sorts of agricultural interest, and they appeal perhaps to those who are slightly more traditionalist in their views, less tied perhaps to a liberal and constitutional outlook. Right. So it's perhaps a slightly more weak Tory, perhaps, than sort of strictly left-right, but even that analogy perhaps is a little shaky. But the populists appear to believe that Greece's international and domestic position will be improved by bringing back King George II as more than just a figurehead. I think as somebody who will provide a kind of bulwark, political stability, will be able to ensure that there isn't a sort of constant seesaw between the political parties, will effectively be able to impose some sort of discipline on the politicians, and provide a focus of national loyalty. And moreover, that the return of George II would be much welcomed by the British.
And so this period, which after all, which in Spain, to some extent in France, in Italy, is seeing the rise of fascist parties. We don't see that at this stage in Greece.
No, I mean there are some, small far-right movements, but essentially you don't have, as it were, a violent sort of proto-fascist movement. Later on, a few years later, under Mitchison, there are elements of fascism that are imitated, but by and large, what you don't have in Greece is I suppose, the focus on irredentism, sort of aggression towards other countries. There are boundary conflicts, obviously, with the Turks, Bulgarians, as well with Albania, but I don't think there's an attempt to create a mass movement based on there's extreme nationalism and military aggression.
Right.
I think at this stage, Greece is far more fearful, shall we say, of the consequences of the rise of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, the potential for aggression from Italy, for example. There had been an unpleasant incident in 1923 over Corfu, when some Italian officers were assassinated in Greece. Mussolini seized Corfu briefly, was forced to hand it back by the League of Nations, but Greece had to pay an indemnity. And I think there was concern that Italy had nationalist ambitions in the area, particularly with regard to Albania. The Italians at this stage, of course, also controlled the Dodecanese Islands around Rhodes. There was always the potential, as far as Mussolini was concerned, for some form of military adventure. Therefore, the Greeks felt vulnerable. They attempted, I think, to balance as far as possible between Germany, which was a major trading partner, and Britain and France, which were their traditional friends. The British, of course, have the largest fleet in the Mediterranean, and Britain is seen as being a traditional ally and a traditional guarantor of Greek sovereignty. So to that extent, I think there's also a view that restoring George II is a way of getting somewhat closer to Britain, and perhaps having a degree of stability and political respectability that will assist Greece in its foreign relations, as well as having a calmer situation domestically.
Good. And so we then get to this recognisable name, Metaxas. That's because that is after the restoration of the monarchy.
Yes, there's an agreement, first of all, by Parliament to restore a constitutional monarchy. And then basically there's a bit of confusion under the restored monarchy, which is confirmed by a plebiscite, but there's still a sort of struggle between the liberals and the populists. And there's a period in 1936 when, in fact, a lot of the political old guard die of natural causes. I mean, Venizelos dies, General Kondilis Saldaris, the populist politician, the former Admiral Douriotis, who was the president, and his successor, Zainis. So there's a kind of clearing out, if I can put it in that rather unsympathetic way, of the older politicians. And Metaxas, who is relatively junior and unknown, rather suddenly becomes prime minister. And at this stage, there's also concern about the growth of the Greek Communist Party, the KKE, because of the depression, unemployment, difficult situation, particularly in urban areas. There is a growth of communist support. There is much alarm about the rise of militant trade union activity. There are frequent strikes and demonstrations. And essentially the political establishment and those around the returned King George II are persuaded by Metaxas that a really alarming situation is developing. There's some degree of disgust, I suppose, of the continuing failure of the old political parties, the Liberals and the Populists, to form a stable government. And in August 1936, in advance of a huge demonstration, Metaxas obtains emergency powers from the king and effectively declares a state of emergency, suspends the constitution, suspends civil liberties. A great many communists are arrested and put in prison.
And just, I mean, what's the industrial economic structure of Greece? One presumes that that it's mainly rural and there's some shipping and very little manufacturing to speak of. But despite that, the communists are perceived to be a real threat.
I think what you have in Greece is a very large number of small firms, largely in the service sector. There's quite a lot of small-scale manufacturing purely for the domestic market, but it's very undercapitalised, very underdeveloped.
Not ideal for the development of a trade union movement, one feels.
No, but nonetheless, as it were, there are unions, particularly in the public sector. There are unions of a sort of political nature right across the sort of shall we say, the sort of craft or professional specialisms. And these unions are largely communist-dominated, so there's a resurgence, if you like, of discontent hinged around themes that the communists are astute at playing to. There's a constant suggestion of, I think, foreign capitalist interference, the evasion of taxes by the rich, effective stoking up of discontent and class warfare. What you also find, I think, in Greece at this period is that some of the large exportable commodities like tobacco, that Greece sold these traditionally to other countries in Central Europe and to Italy, but later on in the 1930s made deals with Nazi Germany, which liked to conduct a barter trade. So you have a situation with the Great Depression where everybody is actually very short of cash. And the Germans rather astutely decide that rather than revive international trade through straightforward financial means, that they reach a series of political barter deals with lots of countries in Central Europe. And they do this with Greece as well. So the deal is effectively Germany takes Greece's tobacco crop, or the bulk of it. In return, Greece takes a whole quantity of German industrial exports. Both countries effectively can get around the financial difficulties they have. There are no sort of payments involved apart from the exchange of goods. But at the same time, there's an effective revival of international trade. But it does rather tie Greece to this German market, and the Germans attempt to apply some degree of sort of political pressure on Greece. They supply quite a lot of goods that are useful for the armed forces or for civil engineering or for industry, and thus feel that they can apply some political pressure to Metaxas to toe the line and be sympathetic to the Axis. And Metaxas, to his credit, tries to balance this by being essentially quite pro-British in his foreign and defence policy, maintains naval links with Great Britain.
So the rather, I mean, as has been characteristic throughout, certainly the foreign diplomacy, rather subtle balancing by Greece of these extremely difficult waters to navigate.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, Metaxas is, I suppose, despite his subsequent reputation as a dictator, despite some of the, shall we say, slightly negative aspects of his rule, someone who is, I think, much appreciated by Greeks today for having, as you say, steered this sort of very difficult course, and in particular, I think, for having prepared the Greek armed forces very well for what he clearly foresaw as being the likelihood of aggression from Italy and Germany.
So let's go to that. Let's go to the beginning of the war, and then the period from 43.
Yes. So what happens, of course, is that war breaks out in September 1939 over Poland. The Germans invade Poland on a trumped-up excuse. Britain advanced to declare war. They have a period of phony war, followed by the great breakthrough on the Western Front in May 1940. The Germans overrun Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, and eventually defeat France altogether. They are thus absolutely dominant on the European continent. And at the same time, if you recall, there is a pact with the USSR, so-called Ribbentrop-Molotov pact, which effectively secures the neutrality of Soviet Russia.
And of the communist parties.
And, of course, very critically, of the Greek Communist Party. So the Greek Communist Party is there under Metaxas, a great many of them in prison. But, of course, they feel, for the moment, as it were, that they're not anxious to engage in any kind of wartime activity. So everybody in 1940 is kind of sitting on the edge of their seat waiting to see what will happen. And what does happen is that, first of all, Italy enters the war on the side of Nazi Germany against Britain in June of 1940. Mussolini is a fairly obvious threat, even in this period before Greece is attacked. There are a number of unpleasant incidents. Indeed, the sinking of a Greek cruiser, the Eli, just simply moored in harbour. Unidentified submarine comes up and torpedoes the Eli. Italy doesn't admit responsibility, but it's fairly obvious to everybody that this is a provocation. So the Greeks are waiting, etc., for the worst to descend.
And it is the Italians. It is in the end Mussolini who invades, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, the British are defeating Mussolini in North Africa. Mussolini is very put out that the Germans have won all these stunning victories, and he's just simply doing badly. And his countrymen, of course, are very unwilling, really, to fight the war on the side of Nazi Germany. So he rather ill-advisedly decides that he's going to have a crack at Greece, thinks this will be a walkover, marshals his forces in Albania, which at this stage is under Italian rule, presents Metaxas with an ultimatum in late October of 1940. This is a famous moment in Greek history where the Italians present this sort of enormous and humiliating ultimatum, expecting the Greeks to knuckle under because they can't resist Italy. But Metaxas essentially is reputed to have said no to the ultimatum. It's probably a bit more complicated than that, but essentially Metaxas takes the stand and refuses Mussolini's threat. Mussolini is already sending his troops over the border, and then to everybody's surprise, the Greeks are magnificently successful. The Italians are thrown back. They invade Albania, almost drive the Italians out, and there's the so-called Winter War. Horrific casualties on both sides, but essentially Greek morale is incredibly high. They've beaten this sort of much bigger.
And a morale which comes having really been quite knocked, certainly knocked by the war with Turkey, and never having been particularly high in the 19th century, where foreign powers seem to be determining much of the nation's fate. Is that fair? That this is a really defining national moment, as it were?
I think this is a very defining national moment. It's certainly true, unfortunately, that in the 19th century the Greeks didn't do particularly well against the Turks or other people. They had some success in the Balkan Wars. The First World War was something of the nature of a disaster, almost a civil war. And of course Anatolia was a complete disaster in the early 20s. So it is certainly very important that Greece had this success against Italy in the end of 1940, beginning of 1941. The problem is, A, that Metaxas dies in January 41, and he's replaced, the king simply replaces him with a rather apolitical but uncontroversial banker called Curzon, who has rather little idea of what to do, except that he engages the British Chief of General Staff, General Dill, and General Wavell, who's the commander in the Middle East, in discussions about how best to join up with British forces and defend Greece against the expected German attack from the north. At this stage, the Germans are moving through Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria, massing forces with a view to overawing both Yugoslavia, which is, as we've been pressured to join the Axis, and it's also assumed somehow that Greece can be bullied into submission or at least cooperation with the Germans. But the Yugoslavs, basically the regent and the monarch, capitulate to German pressure and are immediately overthrown by a popular rebellion. The Germans then fall upon the Yugoslavs and defeat them very rapidly, and at the same time they invade Greece from the north. And before this, the British had been discussing with Greeks where exactly to draw the front line and to hold, as it were, a series of allies against the Germans. There was some terrible misunderstanding about quite where this was to be, and as a result, the Greeks had their forces to the north of Salonika, far too exposed to the German armour. The British were behind Salonika to the south, trying to hold a different line.
Going into every detail of the campaigns, essentially the Germans do occupy Greece, and that through till the beginning of through mid 43, is that right?
To the end of 1944, yes. I mean, the German triumph is essentially one of air power and armour over a very heroic traditional defence. And the poor old Greeks end up with their king and government fleeing the seas to Cairo, where there's a substantial Greek community, obviously, in Egypt. And most of the country is then effectively under German or Italian occupation.
Let's talk a little bit, again, because it becomes so important. So the end of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact means that the communist parties start to oppose the Axis, and this is and we start getting organised resistance.
What happens then is that after the German invasion, rather ironically, a lot of the communists who've been placed in jail by Metaxas actually get released by the Germans. Were not at that stage, as it were, at war with communism. A few months later, they invade the USSR in June of 1941, and then at that stage, obviously, communists in Greece and elsewhere throughout Europe begin resistance activities, essentially to help Soviet Russia. It takes some considerable time before the Greek Communist Party is able to organise effective resistance. This is partly because the country is terribly disrupted. There's mass starvation. Most of the food that was imported is not able to get through. But the communists are obviously used to underground organisation in urban areas. They also have quite considerable organisation in country districts. And much of the country districts, particularly in the mountainous areas in central Greece, are effectively outside Axis control. There are really no Axis soldiers there, so the communists can organise a government and an army in the mountains with rather little fear of interference by the Germans.
So this is in a sense similar to the role the Communist Party plays in France or in Italy, in that it really does have the networks to form the organisation on the ground that resists the Axis powers. In the case of Greece, so the man who becomes important later in the story, the Secretary General, is Zachariadis. Is that right?
That's right. And Zachariadis, in fact, spends most of the war in German prisons.
In Dachau.
Sorry?
In Dachau, I think. Is that right?
I think you're absolutely right. Yes. But there are a considerable number of his lieutenants on the ground, and basically the communists have an umbrella organisation called EAM, which is supposedly cross-party, but in fact very dominated by communist hardliners, and also to the effective communist-led resistance army called Elas. Of course, there were a number of other resistance groups or armies. There was one called EDES, E-D-E-S, and a group of monarchist officers referred to as the Six Colonels, around Colonel Serafis, who was originally a monarchist, but actually over time drifted leftwards and eventually ended up, in fact, as the commander of Elas, who joined the communists. So it was a very confusing situation, but it has to be said that Elas generally was quite aggressive towards the non-communist resistance bodies.
The resistance actually starts, I mean, as in many places. And in fact, presumably Yugoslavia is exactly the same. Resistance also has underneath it a sort of simmering civil war, doesn't it?
That's absolutely correct, because the communists, having not done terribly well politically in terms of winning elections in the pre-war period, and obviously having been suppressed.
Well, they were suppressed, yes.
Attacks us, are, I suppose, inclined to react, as it were, fairly violently to what they see as establishment repression. They have very little faith, I suppose, in, shall we say, a democratic political process being operated fairly. They believe that through their determination to fight for a people's Greece, for a genuine people's state, that they will win the moral political right to lead Greece after the war. They're not, as it were, just simply going to leave this to sort of polite argument in the cafe. They're effectively going to impose this by force.
Are they considered heroic in the countryside by the people in the towns? Is there that same sense, or is there a myth created? Is it a heroic struggle?
I think it is a heroic struggle. I think it depends very much, quite which side of the line you find yourself. And in some areas, of course, what happened was that there was sort of, terrible German or Italian atrocities against villagers, and LS would be the body that effectively hit back and either protected villagers or exacted vengeance from the occupying forces. In many other places, as it were, they didn't see the Germans very much, but they were constantly plagued by feuds and fighting, and sometimes atrocities committed between the rival political factions. So I think the experience of ordinary Greeks at the time was probably extremely varied. Some people were, very polarized and traumatized by fighting, between the Greeks themselves. For other people, it was a straight matter of terrible things done to them by the Germans.
And I have to say, in a sense, that the reason for spending time on it and going over it is, of course, that this does, in fact, in the case of Greece, lead straight into a civil war, which is extremely important in understanding modern Greece. So what we in military, on the military scale of things, the Great Britain liberates Greece in 1944, liberates Athens in 44.
Yes,
is that right?
That's correct. I think what has been happening, though, is that the British are certainly worried about LS, but on the other hand recognise that LS is probably the most effective of the guerrilla organisations. They try and get all the Greek resistance organisations to work together with relatively little success, because they are propping up the government in exile of King George II. But it's fairly obvious that most people in Greece are certainly not monarchists, and even if they're anti-communist, they probably have rather little time for what is going on in Cairo. So there's a kind of disconnect between the official government in exile and what is actually happening on the ground in Greece. I think part of the what immediately happens is that when the Germans withdraw from Greece at the end of 1944, there is almost complete devastation and chaos. The Germans destroy a lot of things as they withdraw, but the country in any event is in the most terrible conditions. It was famine and chaos.
But the British at first are welcomed as liberators, aren't they? I mean, there's great...
Yes, indeed they are, and I think for many Greeks they continue to be regarded as a friend in need. Ellis almost immediately gets into trouble with the British commanding officer, General Scobie, who tries to disarm the various guerrilla factions. Ellis won't be disarmed. There's a battle around Athens where Ellis effectively narrowly failed to take the city. But in most of the rest of Greece, in fact, Ellis doesn't engage.
So again, on the scale of world politics, Churchill's view is that Churchill says treat Greece as an occupied country, and this is because of the view he takes at Yalta, isn't it? That essentially...
Yes, and there's an agreement reached between Stalin and Churchill at Yalta, where effectively Britain concedes control of most of Eastern Europe to Stalin, but as part of the quid pro quo, Britain is effectively guaranteed predominant influence in Greece. And curiously, initially, in fact, the Soviets are probably marginally helpful in persuading LS to cooperate, and it's only later, once relations between Soviet Russia and the West have completely broken down, that Stalin effectively encourages the Greek communists to rebel.
So this is the point at which the resistance of World War II and the fight against the Axis turns into the Cold War fights, doesn't it? Because we also have, I mean, the Greek communists are going to be close allies of Tito's, of the Bulgarians. There's a sense in which they, in whatever Stalin said, want to establish themselves.
That's absolutely right. So what you have is the fairly gradual over a period of about sort of 2 years, sort of gradual takeover of Romania and Bulgaria by Soviet-backed communist parties. In Yugoslavia, there's a rather more violent takeover by Tito's partisans, who completely eliminate all the other political parties immediately, as is the case in Albania with Enver Hoxha. So the communists have established themselves all along the northern border of Greece. But there is a general election in 1946 where, in fact, the communists decide, for various reasons, not to compete. They urge their supporters to boycott the elections, when conceivably they might have actually won a democratic election, or at least have a very powerful position.
As they did in Italy, didn't they, immediately? I mean,
that's right. It was a sort of curious tactical error.
Yeah.
So you actually get the restoration of the monarchy, and you have a relatively right-wing government that moves further to the right as negotiation with the communists breaks down altogether.
And Britain is the occupying power at the time. It's Britain supports the constitution, the constitutional monarchy as the political settlement in Greece.
Yes, indeed. I mean, Britain basically has been concerned of the lack of connection, shall we say, between the non-communist Greeks and the monarch. When George II comes back and elections are held, of course, there is then, shall we say, some degree of proper constitutional authority. There's a democratic mandate for a government, albeit that the domestic situation is one of extreme difficulty, very much dependent upon United Nations relief to prevent famine. And then, of course, in 1947, as the sort of civil war is looming, there's the Truman Doctrine. The United States belatedly wakes up to the threat posed by Soviet Russia to both Greece and Turkey and Iran and other countries, and declares in no uncertain terms that it will provide financial and military assistance to any country threatened by a communist takeover.
As long as they don't let the communists near power. I mean, this is basically martial aid, conditional martial aid.
Conditional martial aid. There is substantial pressure applied to a lot of countries. Obviously, to the Italian electorate are told that they can't emigrate to the USA if they found to have voted communist. In Greece, it's here is martial aid, lots of military, financial, civil support, but provided you stay non-communist. And in Greece, that is actually turning into a situation where the communists are challenging the democratically elected government militarily. It turns into actual fighting between the revived Hellas communist army against the Greek police and military, and in a few months has turned into a full-scale civil war that rages for 3 years or so.
So there is a pause. There is a pause, 45, 46 in the fighting, but nevertheless, the resistance networks are all there. Hellas is still there, and 46, 49 is a return to fighting.
That's absolutely right. I think this has to do much with Stalin's perception that the Western powers are weak, that once he's established his control of much of the rest of Eastern Europe, that he could continue to, shall we say, push against other countries, ignore Yalta, push the communists.
So it's clear, is it? It's absolutely clear that Stalin is supporting Zachariadis. That this is not Zachariadis, going off-piste with Tito.
No, I think it's absolutely plain that this is part of, shall we say, a wider communist strategy of extending control where it appears possible to do so. I think Stalin probably had, shall we say, a fairly astute appreciation of the risks involved. In Greece, he saw a poor country with a potentially shaky government and the possibility of a large, well-armed communist minority actually seizing power seemed to be a very good horse to back. It was a risk worth taking. And so he, and at this stage in collaboration with Tito in Yugoslavia, assisted the Greek communists in 1947. And of course the problem is that relations with Yugoslavia, where Tito has a much more independent base than the other communist leaders in Eastern Europe, Tito effectively breaks with Stalin in the summer of 1948. Tito then takes a very different line towards the Greek communists, who almost entirely remain loyal to Moscow. Tito eventually closes the border between Greece and Yugoslavia, prevents the Greek communists receiving any help from Yugoslavia. This is a shattering blow to the Greek communist resistance, and backed by the Americans, the British, the Greek government forces, with a series of substantial military victories, really in 1949 and 1950, and then effectively the Greek Communist Army kind of pulls over the border into Bulgaria, taking a lot of civilian population that has backed them, and a huge number of Greek communist refugees find their way into Eastern Europe, into Soviet Russia.
But we should note that it's a nasty war, isn't it? I mean, it really leaves deep scars. That there are camps, aren't there? There's torture. I mean, it's really nasty war.
Process of torture and mass killings. It's a very, very atrocious war, and it's possibly in some people's eyes, worse than what happened during the Second World War itself, and it's far more traumatic in the sense that it's often family against family, brother against brother. There is a complete political split. People feel, fanatically, as it were, either that communism must triumph, it's the wave of the future, or that communism is a complete negation of religion and culture and people's deepest beliefs. So it's one of those moments where ideology really tears a nation in half, and many friends and family are, as it were, split, divided forever. And there's the deepest bitterness, I think, in among the non-communist Greeks towards the Greek communists, who were regarded effectively as people who've broken with the nation and, in a sense, betrayed it and become an enemy.
And that trauma is really extremely important in understanding 68, 74, even 81, the years we're coming to.
Absolutely, there's this constant fear in the background of a revived communist threat. For many Greeks, the centre and right, the idea of this sort of communist bogeyman lurking behind the scenes is an extremely powerful one. But obviously, again, on the left, there are many people who feel that it would be a very good idea in personal political terms to heal the terrible rift. So there is a genuine major divide, as it were, across left and right in the Greek political scene that has a huge impact on the later politics in the 20th century.
Good. So 49, the war essentially ends. Is that
yes?
With that move to Bulgaria?
That's right. Yes. So the Greek Communist Army has disappeared. You then have an election in 1950, and the emergence of a figure from the past, General Plasteras, who is this sort of old-fashioned Republican, wins the elections, doesn't have overall control. Another old general, this is General Papagos, who distinguished himself in defeating the Italians, as it were, in the 1940 war, invents a kind of Gaullist political party called the Greek Rally. And basically, Plasteras and Papagos dispute the political scene. Plasteras is in power, but effectively proves to be rather incompetent and profligate. And the Americans, who are becoming more powerful, effectively put some sort of pressure on Plasteras to go. There is also always a sort of slight difficulty with Greek politics in that the constitution doesn't actually prescribe how the electoral system works, and every successive parliament effectively has to determine near its end just under what rules the next election is going to be fought. And in 1952, there was in fact a move away from a system of PR towards something that favoured large parties with a first-past-the-post system of fighting elections, rather like the current British political system. And so the consequence is that Papakos's Greek rally wins a fairly convincing victory. And the Greek rally, effectively through a series of changes, it later becomes the National Radical Union, and later on reinvents itself as the New Democracy Party. But the Greek rally is really the